The Dark History of American Tobacco in Durham, North Carolina, and the South. The European desire to profit off of tobacco and turn a traditional and sacred plant into a cash crop through the use of slave and unjust labor reflects the history of America and the oppression of the black and indigenous communities in an attempt to make higher socioeconomic status synonymous with being white through the exploitation and manipulation of these marginalized communities for capital gain and social power. Tobacco is indigenous and native to North and South America. Mayans, in what is modern-day Mexico and Guatemala, smoked tobacco for sacred and religious ceremonies between the years of 100 to 12,000 BC, depending on which historian you ask. In the years 470 to 630 AD, the Mayans were migrating farther north into what is modern-day southern United States or Mississippi, where Native Americans resided, and Native American shamans adopted similar religious use of the plant. Tobacco became a sacred medicine used to heal various ailments, and depending on the tribe, tobacco was used in different traditional ceremonies. The dark history of American tobacco begins in 1607, when Jamestown, the first permanent English colony in America, is established. Indigenous peoples are then forced into slavery, and in 1609, the first Jamestown settler to successfully grow tobacco on a commercial scale is John Rolfe. 1619 marks the start of African slavery in the English America, when August 20th, 20 African slaves arrive in Jamestown. While there were many reasons that the English exploited African labor and made Africa subject to slavery, tobacco was the key or one of the most integral reasons that the English used slavery. In 1630, through the use of slave labor, Jamestown was exporting 1.5 million pounds of tobacco each year to England. Tobacco was so important to Jamestown and the birth of our nation that profit generated from the cash crop was used to pay taxes, buy goods from England, and purchase slaves to cultivate more tobacco. In Jamestown, virtually everything could be bought in pounds of tobacco, hence the name brown gold. Fast forward basically 200 years, we can see slavery is still alive and has even grown in America. Take, for example, the Cameron family, who owned multiple plantations across North Carolina in Orange, Durham, and Raleigh County, which grew tobacco and various other grains, were purchasing slaves for the use of cultivating tobacco, amongst other crops. And here is an invoice for slaves purchased to work on their plantations. This is an example of a Stagville plantation slave house. Stagville was the largest plantation in North Carolina, and it is in modern-day Durham. Their plantations encompassed 30,000 acres and included 900 slaves cultivating tobacco. The interesting thing about North Carolina was the soil was relatively infertile, sandy, and yielded poor quality tobacco, as well as the other crops like cotton and rice, which were not the highest quality in comparison to South Carolina and Virginia. So North Carolina had low agricultural production, and until a slave named Stephen discovered flue-cured tobacco, North Carolina's economy was not doing too well. But once Stephen discovered this new process for curing tobacco, which consists of curing the tobacco over a span of usually 7 to 8 days for a slower process compared to the fire-cured tobacco, economy completely changed, and we get what is called bright leaf tobacco because the color and the hue of the leaves that results from this new curing process. Of course, Stephen, we might remember his name, but this did not change his status largely as a slave, and he is not the one who got rich off of bright leaf tobacco, which would have been millions of dollars if he had been fairly treated and given credit for his discovery at a tangible level. But his discovery led and laid the foundation for the tobacco industry of the Reynolds and Dukes. In 1856, Abisha Slade, the plantation owner of the farm in which Stephen worked, spoke at an agricultural meeting about flue-cured tobacco. And this happened 15, 20 years later because of Abisha Slade was perfecting the process. And in 1857, Slade is harvesting 20,000 pounds of bright leaf tobacco every year. Flue-cured tobacco single-handedly makes North Carolina the dominant tobacco industry of America. To give you an example and how this relates to the modern day world, this is Brightleaf Square in Durham, North Carolina, right down the road from my high school. So there's a whole district, a whole neighborhood in Durham, North Carolina dedicated to Brightleaf because of all the different various tobacco companies who owned warehouses which would process and produce Brightleaf tobacco. In 1859, a prominent player of the tobacco game, if not the most prominent family in tobacco ever, enters the tobacco industry. And of course, this is because of the discovery of flue-cured tobacco. And a classic example on a person-to-person scale of how this changed the economy, Washington Duke was struggling to grow cotton, and he failed. And so once the discovery of flue-cured tobacco came about in 1859, he enters the tobacco industry and starts doing relatively well. But in 1863, he is drafted into the Confederate Navy, and he liquidates his net worth into tobacco leaf. 1865 is a very important year for American history and one that will shape the world we live in. In January, take into consideration this is near the end of the Civil War, which was, of course, as many of you know, fought over states' rights, but clearly it was fought over slavery. In January, General William T. Sherman, a Union general, issued Special Field Order Number 15, which would grant 40 acres and a mule to freed black families. This land was in Georgia, the land in which they were supposed to receive. And this field order was put into place because there was this huge number of newly freed slaves who were no longer slaves and needed to build wealth and build an economy, build a community, and be a part of America on an equal level to the people who used to oppress them. And the Union put this in place so that this community could build their wealth and own property and do that in response to the land in which they had to they were forcibly brought to and forcibly made to work and cultivate. And the 31st of January, the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. So January 1865 is looking hopeful. in this fight to abolish the systems of slavery and rebuild. But on April 15th, President Lincoln is assassinated. And Andrew Johnson takes over his presidency, the vice president. The unique thing about Andrew Johnson was he was the only Southerner to remain loyal to the Union forces during and after the Civil War. And the reason President Lincoln chose Andrew Johnson as his running mate was because it was a symbol of a unionized country, of the South and the North being one again. It was the Southerner and the Northerner in presidency. So this Lincoln assumed would be perfect to unite the nation. But of course, a war and the sentiment and the bloodshed and everything associated with this war did not die once the Confederates were defeated. Once Lincoln is killed, Andrew Johnson reverses this 40 acres and a mule policy. He destroys Reconstruction efforts, and he orders that the land be returned to original property owners. The land in question was owned and then would be returned to owners in which the Union forces were fighting against to end slavery and to remove their power over this community and over this land. And Andrew Johnson gives that land right back, as well as pardoning various Confederate generals and important figures in the Confederacy. The reason for this has to do with Andrew Johnson's roots. He's from Raleigh, North Carolina, the capital of North Carolina, and he has these traditional racist viewpoints that come to light once he became president. In 1866, black codes, which restricted property sales and criminalized the vagrancy of people of color, led to mass incarceration and prison labor. Vagrancy refers to homelessness, meaning if you didn't have a job and you didn't have a home, any of these, you could be arrested. And we see that because of these events that happened in red, when slavery ends, the oppression of the African American community and the unjust tobacco industry does not. This photo is of students at Stagville Sharecropper School in Durham, NC, in 1920. And I use this photo to show how segregated and unjust and non-different than slavery does the country look 55 years after the 13th Amendment was passed. So what happens when those black codes were passed is you basically had a choice of becoming arrested or agreeing to become a sharecropper. And sharecropping is where a landlord allows tenants to rent land in exchange for a share of the crop. We see that the South was this impoverished area after the Civil War because their economy was based off of slavery. So once slavery is abolished, the South is desperately, well, at least the white people that are in power in the South are desperately grasping at ideas and trying to pass laws and enact various laws to make sure that they can continue having this unjust labor in any form that they can get. And that's why the black codes are passed. And basically what this means for freed slaves is, as this quote says, for newly freed people, many of whom worked the same land, lived in the same housing, and worked under close supervision of the same overseers, sharecropping was like slavery under another name. And you might be wondering, well, why didn't they just not agree? Why didn't they do something else? Well, the reason is largely that this community was starting from the very lowest section of the socioeconomic ladder, and there was a dire lack of resources, hunger, right after slavery was ended. And if you weren't to agree to a job, you were going to get arrested. So black families largely agreed to sharecropping. And with the Cameron family, who owned the Stagville plantation in North Carolina, it is said that the tenants would have to hand over the majority of their crop to the Cameron family. And what we see all over the South is that these were not fair contracts. This was still unjust labor. These sharecroppers were at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder, and they were getting exploited because the landlords were basically profiting, taking all the profit and leaving the sharecroppers with very little at the end of the year. And they were virtually subsistence farmers, just growing to survive. This is a photo of black sharecroppers in Wake County, North Carolina in 1911. And on the other side of the spectrum, people that may not have agreed to sharecropping were vagrant or various other reasons. This convict labor and chain gangs is birthed through mass incarceration. And we see that convict labor built virtually all of the railroad mileage in North Carolina in the 19th century. And what this means is pre-Civil War, slaves were, of course, already forced to do work, and some of which would have been working on the railroads. For example, 1857, the Cameron family had lobbied North Carolina to build a railroad for their local plantation, and then Durham Rail Station is built, which is the center of Durham, the future center. But post-Civil War, this doesn't end. It just changes forms. And convicts build all the railroads that transport the goods of the monopolies of the businesses and that make the world go round, that make America the nation it is, and specifically in North Carolina. This is how the economy was built. And resume the story of Washington Duke. In 1865, after the Civil War ends, he returns home after being captured by the Yankees. And the story is that he walked 135 miles on foot back to Duke Homestead. Duke Homestead was the house that he left behind before the Civil War in which he was drafted. And the liquidated all the property and assets that he owned, in which he liquidated into tobacco leaf. He then uses this tobacco leaf just to start from the very bottom, selling it in town to get bacon and lard and various foods and necessities for life, and to use this money to start his business. And by 1874, Washington Duke has his first tobacco factory as pictured. This is in present-day Durham. And the scene is set. What I mean by that is all of the unjust and exploitive practices that built the nation set up this perfect opportunity. Perfect, of course, for the industry, not in an ethical perspective, but for the industry, there is this very big opportunity to profit off of the way the South has been set up. And while Washington Duke himself may not have been a large part of this, as was the Cameron family and the other plantation owners, it would have been nearly impossible to start a business in the South, even in the nation, that's not based on these racist and discriminative practices, because there would be no railroads, there would be no bright leaf tobacco without the exploitation of the African American community. So what this results in, and through Washington Duke's ability to grow business, he builds a monopoly on tobacco. In 1873, Duke is producing 125,000 pounds of tobacco annually. Washington Duke has a son named James Duke, and James Duke in 1884 utilizes the Bonsack machine, which was invented by James Bonsack in Virginia. And James Duke becomes the first to mass produce cigarettes because of his utilization of this new machine. This leads to 1890, when the Duke family owns American Tobacco Company. When American Tobacco Company is founded. And now this is the largest tobacco industry in the globe. From 1890 to 1910, at the height of its power, the American Tobacco Company consumes 250 various companies, and they end up producing 80% of all cigarettes, smoking tobacco, plug tobacco, and snuff in the entire USA during this period. American Tobacco Company is one of the first 12 businesses in the Dow Jones Average, which is the stock exchange, and they're among gas, oil, railroad, and sugar giants. Just to give you a perspective, it was Standard Oil, which was one of those oil companies in the first 12 businesses. And there's this tobacco monopoly amongst these giants. That's how integral tobacco was to the economy at that point. With that money, Washington and then James Duke was able to found Duke Energy, which is the second largest electricity company in the United States, and that's today. They're the second largest. And they're still called a regulated monopoly, meaning in this picture, all this light that you see, everything in Durham is run on Duke Energy. There's no choice of where to source your energy from. It all comes from Duke. And that is the same in many southern areas that Duke controls. In 1924, Duke University is founded. So we see a monopoly has been built, and this is the start and the continuation of Durham, North Carolina, and the Southern economy. In 1911, the Supreme Court declares that American tobacco violated the Sherman Antitrust Act. At the same time, they are declaring that Standard Oil did the same. And so in the United States versus American Tobacco, the American Tobacco Company is dissolved mainly into Lori Lard, American Tobacco Company, R.J. Reynolds, and Liggett and Myers. And we see that each of these companies goes on to make some of the most famous cigarette brands of all times. And the exploitation, manipulation of the African American community specifically does not end here. Each of these 4 companies is huge, and they just expand from there. So post-Civil War, freed slaves settled in Durham, North Carolina, some of which were from the Stackville plantation owned by the Cameron factory. And if you were a black woman in Durham, NC at this time, or anybody in Durham, NC, first of all, the main workforce was going to be something related to tobacco, and working in the tobacco industry was a new job. So now, if you were a black woman, your most likely position would be to unstem tobacco leaves by hand. They were paid the least, and pay depended on the amount of stemming per day. And so we see across the board, African Americans were not paid equally to white workers. Black women, and specifically, were subject to verbal and physical abuse. And this was common. As this quote shows, factory bosses, quote unquote, treated the factories as if they were plantations, and the hiring process was reminiscent of slave auctions. Foremen lined us up against the walls, remembered one tobacco stemmer, and chose the sturdy, robust ones. Tobacco stemmers in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, earned barely half of what the federal government said was a minimum substance of living. In 1943, R.J. Reynolds, workers stage a strike against overwork and abuse. And around this time is when the third phase of this exploitation and manipulation ensues, where tobacco companies target the black community as well as various communities like the Native American community and the youth. But the focus of menthols is heavily on the black community. So what we see is that Kool cigarettes is founded by Brown and Williamson, a company in Winston-Salem. And they become the most popular menthol of the 30s and 40s. This is one of the first menthols ever. And then in 1956, R.J. Reynolds, also in Winston-Salem, introduced Salem, the first menthol cigarette with filter tip. And as you can see, the name of Winston-Salem, North Carolina, Winston was a cigarette brand and Salem was a cigarette brand. And what these companies do, as seen in the photos on the left and right, is they use famous black athletes and they advertise and try to make these cigarettes seem cool with these stars that everybody looks up to. And it was a tactic to target towards the black community. And if you look to the top right and see the Chesterfield advertisement, you can see that Chesterfield, this is the tobacco warehouse in Durham, and here's how it stands today. So these historic places are still standing. This is also right down the street from my high school, and this is in the Brightleaf district. And then in 1971, the Public Health and Cigarette Smoking Act bans the advertisement of cigarettes on TV and radio. But the tobacco industry is relentless and vicious, and this will not stop them. The only thing it does is change the method in which they advertise. So in 1975, Kool already has a campaign to market towards their target demographic called the Kool Music Campaign. And this includes Kool Jazz Concert in NYC and the Kool Jazz Festivals. Pictured to the left is a depiction of a black artist used to try to make Kool cool among the black community by using music. And of course, everybody is affected by these tobacco campaigns, and it's not just the black community, but centering this community is important because it was written into these various tobacco companies' mottos and intentions that this is going to be a way to profit, is by specifically marketing various brands, specifically menthols, towards the black community. In 1982, or in the 80s in general, Browns and Williamson offer free cigarettes while playing music in inner city neighborhoods. So they're driving around playing music and just handing out cigarettes. And of course, these inner city neighborhoods are largely African American communities. The importance of understanding menthol cigarettes is necessary because menthols are more dangerous than the normal commercial cigarette, which is already dangerous. But as said by the CDC, menthol enhances the effects of nicotine on the brain and can make tobacco products even more addictive. Menthol in cigarettes can make it more difficult to quit smoking. So we see that menthols are more addictive and harder to quit. Reynolds American today, headquartered in Winston-Salem, now owns Newport, Salem, and Kool, all three biggest menthol brands. Take a moment to read the highlighted yellow text. This is written in to R.J. Reynolds' papers on how they want to market towards the black community. And it's crazy to think that this would be written in words. And of course, because they say this group was the key to Kool's growth in the early 1960s, this implies that this text is from after the 1960s, after Jim Crow laws were largely struck down and changed. The tobacco industry is still pursuing these racist ideas. And the marketing worked. We see from 1953 to the 2000s, the percent of African American smokers who use menthols goes from 5% to over 80%. And this is taken from truth.com, a very, if not the most reputable source on smoking. So what does this mean in today's world? Well, things of the past that we try to change, even if we're successful, don't go away overnight. Don't go away when laws are changed automatically. Don't go away when there's even a big wave of trying to change things, because it becomes embedded into our society. So whether we want it at this point or not, based on the consensus and the health ideas and less racist motives behind the world we live in, this is not important in the fact that the historical racist practices will trickle down into how the world is shaped today, specifically North Carolina and the United States. So we see that the number one cause of death in the black community is tobacco-related illness. African American people are more likely to die from smoking-related diseases than Hispanic people and non-Hispanic white people. Between 1980 to 2018, 40% of excess deaths due to menthol cigarette smoking in the U.S. were those of African Americans. And keep in mind that the percentage that African Americans made up of the U.S. during these years was between 10 and 15%. So they're being way overrepresented in the excess deaths of menthol. And this number reflects very well in the percent of adults who smoke, who use menthols today, being 77% black and 23% white. We see almost 3 times more use of menthols among black adults, clearly showing that this marketing over time has been successful for the tobacco industry and been detrimental to the health of the African American community. We see 10 times more tobacco ads in black neighborhoods, and 20% of deaths in the U.S. are from tobacco, and 19.4% of black adults use tobacco. So you can imagine, this is American Tobacco Campus in the center of Durham. And take the example of a black adult working in these warehouses, more specifically a black female in the 1900s, early 1900s, being subject to verbal, physical abuse and overwork. Their grandparents could have been slaves that were exploited to grow and cultivate tobacco. Their parents could have been sharecroppers who were um, basically in a new form of slavery with not much more freedom than slaves had due to this dominant power that the landlords had over the sharecroppers and this unjust, unfair labor system that was created. They, of course, were not being the adult in the 1900s now, 2 generations below slavery, is now being still exploited and paid less than their white counterparts. And then their children who live in this very town could be, or any town, could be targeted to by the tobacco companies in the hopes that the tobacco companies could convince them to smoke menthols. And so we see this 4 generations of the black community is exploited and manipulated by the tobacco industry. And to put that in today's modern world, to show everything I've been saying, that it doesn't go away overnight, even if our intentions and even if the world has changed, the way in which we live is still largely shaped by this, and where you can live and how much money you have the opportunity to make is shaped by tobacco, as well as the many other racist systems of the past. If you look at this red line, specifically the first half of it, look closely, you see this long warehouse right here where my mouse is. That's this warehouse. And south of this warehouse, which goes down from the center of Durham, is the American Tobacco Railroad, which was used to export and import goods. And we see this railroad symbolically and physically wall off the white and black neighborhoods in Durham till today. This Haiti district right here on the right is an historic black neighborhood. And then we see Duke University, Duke Forest, Forest Hills, all on the left or all on the left or the west, being on the west side of this American tobacco rail. Here's a map to show that. If you see black is green, representing the majority race, the greener it gets, or the more color it gets for any of the races, is the more majority that race holds in that area. So we see this is green and this is blue. And if you look again, trace this line, and you see it perfectly maps out the neighborhoods. And then this is the income of these neighborhoods. So we see that the black neighborhoods colored in green largely turn red. This whole east side of Durham largely turns red, which was largely green here. It just expands as the population expands down southward. And then the white side largely turns green. So we see this firsthand, that the effects of the industry as well as other systems trickle down into the neighborhoods and the income that we earn today. Regarding Native Americans, Indigenous Americans are actually the most disproportionately affected by the tobacco industry. In the 1880s, traditional use of tobacco is largely banned under U.S. law. And what happens is that this sacred tobacco that was pure, natural, and free of additives is largely replaced with commercial tobacco, which is, of course, more dangerous, has chemicals, is more addictive. Because, in part, natives want to continue these cultural traditions, but they have no choice in the tobacco that they use, and they're almost forced into using this commercial tobacco, of course, for profit. So this leads to Native Americans having the highest rates of smoking in the U.S. today, having a higher risk of death and disease caused by using commercial tobacco products, and are more likely to smoke cigarettes than other racial or ethnic groups in the United States. Some of the tactics that the tobacco industry used included price reductions on cigarettes, coupons, giveaways, gaming promotions, charitable contributions, sponsorships, and casino and bingo promotions. These companies also leveraged tribes' unique sovereign status, exempting them from state cigarette taxes, which means that these companies, because of their status that they didn't have to pay cigarette taxes, they tried to sell them more at that cheaper price. And to sum this all up, I made this Monopoly game board themed by the South and by tobacco. And the words how to set up Monopoly basically relate to how America was set up to allow this industry to dominate and to have the ability to be in its position that it is today and has been for the history of our country. So you see the steps. One relates to colonization, two relates to the start of slave labor, and then this turns into sharecropping, mass incarceration, and convict labor. And then these companies just take advantage of all this by, of course, growing and dominating and monopolizing. So you see that the cheapest property on this Monopoly board is that original cotton farm that Washington Duke failed at cultivating, and it goes all the way around with various different chances, like the discovery of flu-cured tobacco, until the most expensive property is, of course, the American Tobacco Company. And all of this information comes from reputable sources that I made sure to largely double check on another source for the most important information to really make sure that I'm getting and discussing the most up-to-date information. For example, one source was putting the Jamestown production in 1670 at 25 million pounds per year, and it sounded unrealistic, while the American Tobacco Company in the future was producing like 125,000 per year. So I researched more and found that it was actually closer to 1.5 million. And so also the song in the beginning is cited up here, and there's a vast bibliography. Anyways, I would like to mention that finishes the presentation, but it is not all horrible and bad, this world that we live in now, of course. The only reason I'm writing this paper is because I'm going to cut off the video.